Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In meeting 5 of Qualitative Research Methodology in ELT, we will talk about sampling techniques in qualitative research. Sampling techniques in qualitative research. Qualitative research is more flexible with respect to sampling techniques than quantitative research. This flexibility reflects the emergent nature of qualitative research design, which allows researchers to modify methodologies as data are collected. Therefore, the sampling techniques discussed in this section are suggestive rather than prescriptive, and they do not necessarily exhaust the possible ways in which a qualitative research sample might be selected. Types of purposeful sampling. As we explained above, Patton uses the term purposeful sampling to refer to the practice of selecting cases that are likely to be information-rich with respect to the purposes of a qualitative study. He identifies 15 purposeful sampling strategies, each of which serves a particular purpose in a qualitative study. The following is a description of each strategy. Number 1. Extreme or deviant case sampling focuses on cases that are unusual or special. The findings of research on extreme cases can provide an understanding of more typical cases. An example is George Noblet's study of how teachers use caring in their instruction and relation of caring to power. To study this phenomena, he chose an exceptional case, an elementary teacher named Pam. Her exceptionality is conveyed in Noblet's description of her. She, Pam, was one of the opinion makers in the building, was revered by white and African American parents, and was the teacher who assumed charge of the school whenever the principal was out of the building. She was reputed to be the most effective teacher in the building, adept with difficult students, and later concluded with difficult parents. She never missed a chance to talk with parents and was frequently called by the school secretary to deal with parents' complaints. Her power was such that she, in many ways, chose me to be in her classroom for the caring study rather than the other way around. The use of an exceptional case like Pam is helpful because the teacher characteristics to be studied are easy to detect and occur frequently. A possible problem with extreme cases is that educators might dismiss findings based on them simply because they are extreme or defiant. Number 2. Intensity sampling. Intensity sampling avoids this problem because it involves selecting cases that manifest the phenomenon of interest intensely but not extremely. As an illustration, suppose a researcher was interested in the characteristics of in-service presenters. If an extreme case sampling approach were used, the researchers might select star performers in the world of in-service education, individuals who regularly make keynote presentations at national conferences and who consult nationally and internationally. These cases might be interesting but of little relevance to educators who do in-service presenting on a much smaller scale. Therefore, the researcher might consider selecting educators who are highly respected as in-service presenters within their school district or local region. These educators still qualify as exceptional cases, but they are more like the vast majority of in-service presenters. By studying these less extreme cases, the researcher is more likely to obtain findings that deepen the understanding of most in-service presenters about ways in which they might improve. Also, The findings might enlighten administrators about reasonable qualification and expectations for local staff who aspire to be in-service presenters. Number 3. Typical case sampling, as one might expect, involves the selection of typical cases to study. This strategy might be particularly useful in field tests of new programs. Developers and policymakers want their programs to be effective for the great majority of the individuals to be served by the program. Otherwise, the program will not be considered cost-effective. Also, stories about typical cases might be useful for selling the program to various constituencies. These first three sampling strategies, extreme or deviant case sampling, intensity sampling, and typical case sampling, complement one another. None is inherently superior to the others. Each serves important but different purposes in qualitative research. Number 4. Maximum variation sampling. Maximum variation sampling involves selecting cases that illustrate the range of variation in the phenomena to be studied. For example, suppose a researcher wishes to study the experiences of different school districts that have received state-funded grants to develop innovative projects. In using a maximum variation in sampling strategy, the researcher might select districts that vary widely in size, community setting, for example, urban, rural, proximity to a university that has College of Education, and the type of project undertaken, for example, curriculum development, staff development, services for a certain type of student. This strategy serves two purposes: to document the range of variation in the funded projects and to determine whether common themes, patterns, and outcomes cut across this variation. Number 5. Stratified purposeful sampling. Stratified purposeful sampling is slightly different than maximum variation sampling. A stratified purposeful sample includes several cases at defined points of variation, for example, average, above average, and below average with respect to the phenomena being studied. By including several cases of each type, the researcher can develop insights into the characteristic of each type, as well as insight into the variation that exists across types. In contrast, a researcher who uses maximum variation sampling is likely to have one case of each type, which might be insufficient for drawing conclusions about that type. Number 6. Homogeneous sampling. Homogeneous sampling is the opposite strategy of maximum variation sampling. Its purpose is to select a sample of similar cases so that the particular group that the sample represents can be studied in depth. For example, suppose a researcher is interested in orientation programs for incoming high school students. In doing pilot work, the researcher discovers that many high schools have orientation programs for all students, but only some high schools have a special orientation program for at-risk students. In planning the main study, the researcher might decide to limit the sample of cases to orientation programs for at-risk students. These programs can be the focus of intensive data collection and study rather than being one aspect of a broader study of orientation programs in general. Number 7. Critical case sampling. Critical case sampling involves selecting a single case that provides crucial test of theory, program, or other phenomenon. Theories in education tend not to yield such precise prediction as are found in the physical science, and therefore a critical case sampling strategy might have less applicability. However, this sampling strategy could prove useful in studying educational programs and related phenomena. For example, a researcher might wish to evaluate a program by selecting a site in which it would be very difficult for the program to succeed. If a study of this case yielded positive results, one would be justified in claiming a strong generalization of the form. If this program works here, it should work anywhere. Number 8. Snowball or chain sampling. Snowball or chain sampling involves asking well-situated people to recommend cases to study. As the process continues, the researcher might discover an increasing number of well-situated people and an increasing number of recommended cases, all or some of whom can be included in the sample. Also, the names of a few individuals might come up repeatedly in talking to different well-situated people. If this type of conversion occurs, these individuals would make a highly credible sample. Number 9. Criterion sampling. Criterion sampling involves the selection of cases that satisfy an important criterion. This strategy is particularly useful in studying educational programs. For example, suppose a researcher is planning to study a particular graduate program that prepares educational administrators. Using a criterion sampling strategy, the researcher might select two types of cases to study. Number one, recent graduates who took more than 10 years to obtain their doctorates. Number two, recent graduates who received their doctorates in 3 years or less. A study of cases that satisfied one or the other of these criteria most likely would yield rich information about aspects of the program that work well or poorly. Number 10. Theory-based or operational construct sampling. Theory-based or operational construct sampling is used when the purpose of the study is to gain understanding of real-world manifestation of theoretical constructs. To illustrate, we can consider Piaget's theory of intellectual development, which is widely used to interpret educational phenomena. One of the constructs of the theory is the concrete stage of development. A researcher might wish to develop further understanding of this construct by studying how it is manifested in particular setting. To achieve this purpose, the researcher would need to select a sample of children who are at this stage of development. Then she could do an intensive analysis of how they function intellectually in various situations of interest to her. In this example, then the selection of cases is determined by a particular theoretical construct. Number 11. Confirming and disconfirming case sampling. Confirming and disconfirming case sampling is done to validate findings of previous research. The validation process can be carried out in two ways. The first approach is to study cases that are likely to confirm patterns, themes, and meanings discovered in previous case studies. If the new case or cases are confirmatory, the validity and generalizability of the patterns, themes, and meanings are strengthened. The second approach is to look for cases that are good candidates for disconfirming previous research findings. If the findings from these cases replicate previous findings of patterns, themes, and meanings, their validity and generalizability are greatly strengthened. However, if the findings are in fact disconfirming, the researcher might develop new insights about the generalizability limits of previous findings. Number 12. Purposeful random sampling. Purposeful random sampling involves selecting a random sample using the methods of quantitative research. Nevertheless, the purpose of random sample is not to represent the population, which would be its purpose in quantitative research. Rather, the purpose is to establish that the sampling procedure is not biased. For example, if a researcher is evaluating a program for which some constituencies are critical, the researcher can gain more credibility for his findings if he selects cases at random rather than looks for success stories to report. Recommendation for selecting a research sample. Number 1. In reporting a study, describe in detail the target and accessible population, sampling procedure, sampling frame, and volunteer rates. Number 2. In quantitative research, select random sample rather than a convenient sample whenever possible. Number 3. If a convenient sample is selected, describe its characteristic in sufficient detail to enable others to infer the population it represents. Number 4. In quantitative research, select a sample size that maximizes the likelihood of rejecting the null hypothesis at a satisfactory level of statistical power and that, if appropriate, allows for subgroup analysis and sample attrition. Number 5. In qualitative research, consider which of the various types of purposeful sampling is most appropriate for studying the phenomena of interest. Number 6. If any members of the selected sample choose not to volunteer, collect data to determine whether the volunteers are representative of the non-volunteers or the accessible target population on relevant characteristics. Number 7. Use various procedures to maximize the volunteer rate for the selected sample.